working with audiovisual performance, installation, film. They study the intensities of late capitalism, something I'm curious about further discussing on that theme. They engage with networks, interfaces, accesses, and their current research focuses on the relationship between the real-time simulation and computer vision. Thanks so much for joining us here. That's really exciting.
Thanks for having us.
And of course, I'm very excited about your performance, which is going to happen later tonight, and that's what we're going to discuss today. And I'm wondering, could you give us a short introduction on your Performance God Mode episode, number 1?
Yeah, for sure. So God Mode episode 1 follows an AI that is training in a simulated supermarket. This supermarket is a replica of those used to train sort of automated or AI systems in cashierless stores, essentially. And the performance follows the AI as it both is asked or required to look at the items on the shelves and learn their names, identities, and also as it searches for a way that it might be able to move beyond this existence. And the performance is real-time rendered in the Unreal game engine, and we use kind of voice modulation, live sound, and live navigation to build this narrative. There's a key point in it as the AI kind of searches for its way out, where the audience is asked to interact via their phones, and so today we'll have more people interacting than ever before.
Okay,
really
exciting.
Excited. Yeah.
Could you tell me why the supermarket? Do you think supermarkets are interesting in all sorts of ways? But I'm curious to hear what's the fascination with supermarkets, also in relation to AI, because I guess that's somewhat of maybe an uncommon relationship, maybe not.
I think I can say something about this. We were thinking a little bit about the way that this character would develop in the performance, this kind of AI, and it sort of becomes increasingly frustrated and increasingly bored of its condition. And it felt like the supermarket was a fairly restrictive and fairly boring space for it to kind of like exist in. We are interested in this kind of computer vision systems, training in real-time 3D render simulations, and we could have gone with, I don't know, self-driving car. But that kind of world feels like there's a lot more freedom in that kind of world somehow. So we were trying to think about an application of AI that exists or that needs training in a simulation that is fairly constrained and that can kind of frustrate a character. It kind of tied into the development of this character. So yeah, a supermarket was a space that definitely like had limits. There's only 4 or 5 aisles and it's a very small space, but there's countless items, and this AI is finds it very tasking to have to like stay in this world. Also, it's just a space that is fairly relatable. I think it's a space that's very relatable at the same time in its application. It's a space. It's a tech stack that's quite complex. Like when you go to an actual cashierless store, it sort of presents itself as a familiar space, but it's really an interface to this datafied kind of stack of different systems. So we wanted to play with that as well and just kind of situate the work in a space that an audience could like find a relation to.
Because is that to what extent? I mean, first of all, how does that work? So this AI is being trained to understand what items are, right? Like what is Nutella versus pasta versus something.
Yeah.
Is that actually applied right now in certain spaces, or how would it translate from understanding what an item entails to interacting on that on like a level of being able to scan or being able to pay?
Sure. So it's really a computer vision system that we're basing this on, but a computer vision system that is trained and based on kind of neural network. So these are applied, I mean, within like wider systems. They're not the only component, but they are applied in the kind of cashierless stores that we sort of see increasingly growing. And there is a process of kind of recognizing items that people have picked up in concert with some other sensors that are in this kind of datafied space, and allowing then kind of allowing as an input to the the process of checking out or of being recognised as having purchased something by leaving the shop with it. So these things are becoming kind of a part of at least someone's kind of experience within major cities, maybe more than everywhere, but they're a growing.
Because that's the pay-as-you-go method, right? It's
exactly.
like Amazon's doing, where you walk into a store, you buy stuff, you just walk out, essentially.
Yes.
And somehow you magically pay.
Yes.
Supposedly.
Yeah.
There's around, I think there's around 20 to 25 in London now, just like flagship Amazon stores, and there's also major like supermarket chains that are starting to implement the same technology from Amazon or their version of it. But pretty much, there's cameras, like countless cameras and lots of light and very well stocked items that people can pick, and they're being looked at by these cameras running this kind of neural network, and you can enter and get out, and whenever we tried it, we always got actual mistakes. So I think Amazon is happy to, like, you can be refunded if there's mistakes. I think Amazon is very happy to lose money to like test these quite complex systems at the moment.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Because I guess that's the tricky thing, right? Like, to what extent can you really automate it? I mean, even thinking about, in the Netherlands, there's a lot of this thing where you would self-scan, which essentially is just you basically doing the job of the cashier. So, I mean, it's supposedly it's fun, but like you're just doing someone's job, who then has to control you on checking that you're not stealing anything. So it doesn't make too much sense.
Yeah.
But at least like there's a lot of, you can accidentally steal something or like intentionally steal something. And if you check it, like, is that like, I mean, there is a degree of error.
Yeah, there's for sure a degree of error. I think, like Francesca said, when we have tried these things, there are strange mistakes that happen. They're also quite difficult to get into, not in a like you're blocked in any way, but unless you're kind of smoothly within the kind of Amazon payment system, like you regularly use your account, for example, it seems to be quite difficult to get to the right part of the app to get in. So they're presented as incredibly smooth interfaces to a shopping experience, a physical interface where I, pick up an object from the shelf to select it, move through the store, leave through the barriers to check out, for example. I think, the lighting as well helps them to feel smooth and shiny. There's a certain, like, intensity to the space. But they do seem to break down. They seem to be a kind of a promise or a hope more than a reality, I guess.
More like a working prototype to some degree.
Yeah,
possibly.
Yeah, exactly. And we have looked at the kind of prototype versions as well. They're quite interesting because you can then see some of the other sensors that are placed into the space. So when you go into the store, you don't necessarily see the fact that there's also, for example, a weight sensor on the shelf. But when you see the prototype, you can see that it's made up of loads of like almost little scales that are there that weigh the things as you lift them off. So you then understand a little bit more what's going on.
So there's different forms of input that then actually form this picture. It's not purely vision even, necessarily.
Primarily, but not only.
And there's other stuff going into it too.
Yeah, the vision is important to understand the space as a whole, but then there are like more specific, almost button-like inputs of weight, etc.
And I was wondering, because I was looking at other works that you're doing that look a lot, where you're looking a lot at basically the global finance markets and like how, I mean, tax evasion is something that comes back in different work. So I was wondering from this more economic perspective, looking at these kind of training models and the way it supposedly replaces human labor to some degree, often maybe doesn't exactly. How do you see this in terms of the developments in how work is structured or how work plays into this?
We originally actually came into the project because we were interested in the kind of startups that are training AI models on synthetic data, so this type of data that's not collected from the real world but generated from simulations like ours. And we were kind of interested in their claims. There are a lot of like quite grandiose kind of PR claims, things like, this data is generated from nothing, from thin air, which we've heard this from a few of these startups, and it sort of implies that there is a lot less bias than there would be if, we were to collect this data from the real world. But there's obviously a number of decision-making processes there which bring a lot of bias with them as well. So that was the initial kind of angle. Although we're working on this project for like a year and a half almost, we looked a little bit less at the actual application of the AI, and we became much more interested in the process of training AI itself. So we're not thinking so much right now about the kind of like impact that this type of specific application of AI may have. We have really been thinking about the potential for this simulation, the kind of technical potential for the simulation to allow interaction and automation and the relation of interaction and automation with narrative and narrative development in a performative setting. And we're also been thinking a lot about the relationship between simulation and AI training from kind of like epistemological point of view. So what does it mean to simulate reality and train a machine to operate in the real world through a simulation? What kind of questions do we have around the knowledge that's generated within the simulation, the perception and the language that's used? So we have stayed in this kind of part of the investigation, and we didn't follow that similar pattern that maybe we had followed in previous work of looking at the kind of corporate application.
Yeah. That seems very tricky, right? Because then you would guess, a simulation by definition is a reduction of reality. It's never representation. And even if it is a representation, it's a reduced representation. So you miss all sorts of information incidents, things that can happen. I don't know, something falls off the shelf, can you still read it? There's all of that kind of stuff of error and the chaos of everyday life, maybe, that comes into it, which is not in the simulation, I guess.
Yeah. There's interesting processes, and so one of the things that we do with this work and that we have done with previous work is this idea of kind of modeling or like replicating a system to kind of probe it, understand it, explore it with others. So the previous work with tax havens, we kind of set up a corporate structure and invited others to be part of it with us. In this, we kind of set up a simulation and invite others to be part of it with us as part of the audience for the performance. And so that there's these different kind of modeling of these processes that we do within the work, one of which is this idea of kind of procedural generation. So the idea that the space can be created and recreated multiple times based on kind of random number generators or other kind of systematic things. And in those, there is the opportunity to introduce or reject chaos or error. So the way that you set up the system that, for example, lays the items out on the shelf gives you the amount of chaos, but you have to make that decision. And often those decisions get lost or kind of disappear as you move throughout the work. So this is something that we identified an idea of in looking at the existing kind of vendors, in looking at the way that 3D worlds or renders are produced and kind of exploring that. And then it's also something that I think we can recognize in our working process as well. Like now we've been doing this work for over a year, looking back at the file and looking at the decisions that we made a year ago based on what we knew then, have shaped the way that the performance can work, have shaped the way that the audience can interact, have shaped the way that the space can look. And actually, not only have we kind of set out to model visually and kind of think kind of technically about the world that we're creating, I think there's a certain amount of, modeling the development process, modeling the production process of these things that is inescapable when you're using the same tools as the vendors that we look at or as the systems that we look at. And I think that can be quite interesting. And to kind of come back, to the idea of like simulation and what is contained and what is lost, or what is represented and what is lost. I think that's a really interesting thing that we do kind of think about in the work. Like we use existing assets, so it's not based necessarily on things that are produced custom for the work. Some things come from content packs, and that again is kind of pre-made decision for you that changes the variation and the flexibility and the randomness and the chaos and all these things that are possible. And that putting those kind of guardrails in to the way that we put it together, the way that people can interact with it, I think can be a kind of, give it a key feel.
Yeah, because I guess that kind of working with a system on the one hand and then kind of creatively reshuffling it, that's also what you do within the narrative itself, right? Could you tell me something about how that works, how the narrative or the monologue of this AI is written or co-written, as I understand, with AI?
Yeah, the narrative arc is sort of split in 4 moments, 4 kind of parts, and there's an introduction, there's a moment of hardship, which is the training. There's a kind of like a moment of discovery, which is a point in the performance where, I shouldn't say so much because we're going to perform it in an hour.
Yeah.
Don't give spoilers, please no spoilers.
There's a key moment in the performance where the hardship is turned on its feet, and so like this AI finds a way to complete its training without really completing its training, and then there's an epilogue. And throughout, the AI goes through a process of almost, it initially has this kind of like very objective monologue where it describes the world as if it's debugging the world. So it's describing the simulation as it's procedurally being generated, as like different configuration of the stores come together. And then the more it trains, the more its kind of personality comes out, and it gets frustrated, and the more this monologue becomes inward. And in some ways, it becomes a bit like a weird stream of consciousness where the AI stops debugging objectively and externally kind of the world, and starts only looking at its own interpretation of that world. And you know, this is obviously a fictional device that we use to try and say something about this AI as more than just like a system made up of data, and it's more than just a database. So yes, as it talks, there are moments from the script that have been co-written with GPT-3, so this large language model, which is kind of like like an AI model you can prompt, and in prompting it, you can ask it to kind of like respond back to you. And if you know how to ask, it can respond with a lot of fantasy, fantasy in terms of like the vocabulary choice and the kind of words that you get back and the kind of like sentences that you get back are really interesting. So we use this for different moments of the script, which doesn't mean that like GPT-3 wrote the performance or the script.
Just
like
there's elements that are played into it.
Exactly, yeah. We knew what the narrative arc would be, but I would say probably a third of the monologue from the AI is directly produced by GPT-3 in response to prompts that we gave it, where we would ask it to impersonate this AI model and kind of like speak out what type of feelings it would have, or embody the idea of this AI. And it's amazing the stuff that came out. Actually, some of the sentences are really fun, and we've directly incorporated them into the performance.
And I was wondering, because this whole existential, I mean, kind of has an existential feel to it, I guess, right? The whole monologue. Where on the other hand, the process itself of training, and I mean, there's something very nearly banal about understanding that something is a certain product in an aisle in the supermarket. Yeah. So they're very distinct worlds of something that is very, I mean, objective maybe, or just very simple or very to the point. And then these kind of deeper feelings that maybe we are as people map onto AI, that obviously, I don't know, I guess there's not really such a thing necessarily in it already. Yeah. How do you kind of play on this idea of, on the one hand, this very emotional, existential, very human take on technology, and then the technology itself being a system that just does tasks, right?
Yeah, I think this has been something that we've, again, kind of sort of put a structure in place to kind of think through. So we're trying to consider a little bit, perhaps, what a system that experiences the world through vision, and for which the world is only rendered supermarket item shelves and a square that it.
I mean, it does sound a little bit sad.
It does sound a little bit sad, and I think it's really like hard for us to kind of think about it in any other way. And the work is intended to communicate with people, so it's work for people to experience. So I think there's that thinking through the kind of tech system that exists, thinking of what its kind of limitations and how that would shape its kind of life world and its understanding, becomes a way to then build this narrative. I think we're interested in, for example, what Catherine Hales says about AIs being inscriptions rather than incorporations. So in line with kind of GPT-3, this idea that it's a system that comes first from text and then comes to some form of understanding about embodiment or about the world. In this case, while still stuck in a fake version of the world, which is kind of interesting. Whereas for us, we come from embodiment and we come to text as we learn language.
Or
so
language,
we come to that kind of in an inverse way. So actually, I think kind of following her in that, there's not necessarily a way that we can understand the experience, if there even is such a thing, of an AI. I think there isn't necessarily an experience yet. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't. I don't think this is the time to make a pronouncement on like consciousness of AI, especially if it's being recorded and there is one later on. Let's stay safe. But as kind of, as people working on this and kind of working for and with an audience, I think coming from what we can understand to then think through this is actually quite an important thing.
I think also this kind of like mapping of like, you know, human or anthropomorphizing or humanizing this kind of AI also comes from the fact that in the simulation there's different kind of entities, so items that the AI is looking at. There's the AI which is actually a camera model that's kind of flying around the store and being shown different items. And then there's the shelves, the walls, the world itself made of like, the kind of like a cube, which is the supermarket. And then there's these human models, which represent the kind of like missing component. I mean, if you ever see like Amazon Fresh or Amazon Pay-as-you-go stores debugging videos, you can see these kind of like IDs of, you know, tracking people, and then you can see these kind of like floating arms grabbing items, and you just see the arm. And in some ways, the AI that's training on these items will also have to train on this understanding of what is the end that's like picking the item, not just the item. Yeah. So in our simulation, these is represented with like human models, which are actually just like silhouettes, like standing silhouettes of human models, as opposed to actual real human models. And the AI understands, or not understands, but the AI knows that these human models have a property, which is to be in contact with items that the AI itself, the camera model, does not have. The camera model is only like next to or amongst kind of items, and it describes itself with this formal kind of language, which is an actual language used for computer vision systems in robotics. And so it wishes that it had that property of being in contact with items, and because of that, it sort of projects its own image of itself in the image of the human silhouette model, because it wishes it had that sort of property. So we kind of like justified that back in there with this, and that's why when you see the performance, you see this kind of weird face, which is the face that the AI imagines for itself, composed of items that it has learned to recognize. So it only imagines on its face things that it has seen in the world. So its eyes are like, jars of mayo, and the ears are like cans of beans. But these items are composed in a kind of like humanoid face, in the image of the face of the thing, the entity that it wishes to be, because it has a property that it does not have. That's
yeah. And I guess that's also the whole thing of what you mentioned before with like, okay, there's the embodied understanding of the world, there's purely text, which is purely information. And then where's meaning, right, somewhere in that? Because that's not only a physical, sensorial, like, understanding of the world, it isn't text either. You just have lists of groceries, basically. Yeah. Where's the meaning in that? Where's the understanding of it's still being organized for humans in the end? Still you want some kind of organization that makes sense?
Yes. Yeah, it still goes to that in the end. I guess there's some meaning layer, very minimal meaning layer in that kind of next to, on top of language that's used for these other simulations, because that kind of allows a connection between entities. I guess we're kind of like imagining it building on top of those, but again, like still starting from text. Still, that's like a programming language that it gets fed. Yeah.
Something else, I was also very interested in this whole idea of the interaction with the audience, because from what I understand, but correct me if I'm wrong, in a way it becomes kind of this collaborative process, right? Between the performance, which is the whole story that we've discussed so far of the AI, and then the audience who's here in Utrecht, but also people online, joining in and participating. Could you tell me a little bit more on how that works?
Yeah, the audience takes a very specific role. So again, somewhere in this tech stack that we're modeling and exploring is a process called domain randomization. And domain randomization is making changes to the images that are exported for then training an AI system such that the training is more robust. So for example, if you're training something to recognize a glass, you can't only show it on top of a black table, it also needs to be on top of a range of different textures and backgrounds so that it can learn what is glass and what is not glass. And that's really what the audience does as kind of an assist to the AI system and as part of the system. And we're working with someone at the moment called Alistair Milne, who has this kind of theory around this as a kind of turret operator.
Yeah. I mean, like there's just to clarify on the domain randomization. So normally this is a machine learning technique where again the world around the object that's been learned changes in order to create variation, and that's normally automated. That's what the audience does. We turn the automation into interaction. So we wanted them to kind of learn through use, if you want, but also just have fun. Like it almost there's like a like an idea of like keeping the audience entertained in some way while also helping the AI to train.
Kind of like button mashing or grinding in games when you play with other people.
Yeah, because the input hardware for this interaction is just a button on the phone. So the kind of like emergent gameplay, really what happens is that people are just doing this all the time. And it's really fun because the AI gets frustrated in response to this world constantly changing, in response to the audience interaction, and gets frustrated, and that helps carrying the narrative forward. So there's this direct relationship between the interaction and narrative development. But what were you talking about? Turret operator. Yeah, there's this turret operator, right? So this kind of like role of assisting someone. It's the kind of gameplay or
like being the gun on the back of the Jeep in Halo, for example. So someone else is driving and you're you're doing the shooting while they navigate you around, really.
Yeah. So that's how we're thinking of the gameplay. Like the audience is only assisting this AI and it's assisting it in training about the world, but then in return the audience gets trained by the simulation itself in the kind of techniques that are part of machine learning, kind of R&D. So there's this kind of dual relationship where everyone is assisting someone else in kind of learning something. And once this kind of hardship moment that I mentioned earlier, once the AI kind of gets around the training and understands how to train faster, this relationship is turned on its feet even more. So the audience understands how there's a tendency to cheat or there's a tendency to go for a path of least resistance in these kind of simulations. Particularly evolutionary ones, where like an agent would have to like continue trying and survive as long as it can. And so again, like this idea of the relationship between audience and AI and audience, or audience and simulation and audience, is kind of
intertwined in all different ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a last question, because I think we're heading towards the end. It's a very quick question, which is, can you tell us anything about episode 2? Since the title implies there's going to be more. Is there anything you can say?
We can't tell you anything about episode 2.
No, yeah.
Or we won't tell you anything about episode 2.
Fair enough. I had to try.
But we can say something. So the series we're thinking about is not just made up of episodes. So episode 1 is the first, obviously, and it's the performance. It's a performance. The second output from the series is a game, and it's called God Mode Arcade. And this is the second kind of thing we're working on at the moment. This is almost like a standalone online multiplayer game, which furthers the kind of interaction that happens in the performance when the AI is training. So we have kind of like taken that out of the performance and packaged it into a more complex kind of multi-user interaction. And that's what we're working on at the moment. And episode 2 will continue building on the character development and kind of like problematize a little bit what happens at the end of the first episode, but that will be later on next year. So for now, the next thing coming out is this game, this online multiplayer game.
Oh, very interesting. Thanks so much for joining, and I'm looking forward to your performance at 9:30 here in Utrecht, but also online if you want to join in and press some buttons and be part of the whole journey, right?
Smash the interface.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you. It
so
was
much.
lovely for that you were joining us. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Next up, we are going to switch back to the main hall here in Utrecht to the panel discussion, Why Theory? Thanks for joining in.